The door will break in less than an hour. Bram Fischer knows it. He can hear the city breathing outside his Johannesburg flat. Cars in the dark, a police siren far away, the dull hum of a country, pretending to be normal while its security police move like shadows. On the small wooden table in front of him lies a stack of papers, names, safe houses, routes, plans that can keep the leaders of the liberation struggle alive a little longer. If the police find these, dozens of people will vanish into cells. Some will never come out. Across the city, in a neat government office with polished floors and fluorescent lights, another man is awake. A young, ruthless prosecutor, rapidly rising through the apartheid system, sifts through his own stack of papers. Percy Utah. Brilliant, ambitious, hungry. His mission is simple: crush the underground movement, win the biggest political trial in South African history, and make his name. He wants Bram Fischer's head on a legal platter. 2 lawyers, 2 Afrikaners, 2 men trained in the same legal tradition, now locked into a race against time. One to save lives, one to destroy a movement. Bram looks at the clock. The security branch has been watching him for weeks. He can feel the circle tightening. Tonight is the last night he can stay here, in his own home, as a free man. How did a boy born into the heart of Afrikaner privilege become the most wanted white man in apartheid South Africa? To understand that, we have to go back to the flat, dry heart of the country, to a town that smells of dust and legal leather, where a baby named Bram Fischer took his first breath and his first steps toward betrayal in the eyes of his own people. Bloemfontein, 1908. The sky is an almost violent blue, so bright it eats color. In a large house with high ceilings and polished wooden floors, the air tastes of furniture polish and pipe smoke. On the walls hang solemn portraits of men with heavy beards and unreadable eyes. These are Bram's ancestors, leaders of the old Orange Free State, pillars of the Afrikaner nation. His grandfather, Bram Fischer, had been Prime Minister of that republic. His father, Percy Ulrich Fischer, will become a respected judge. The law is not just a profession in this family, it is a religion. Little Bram toddles across the veranda, a blonde child in a spotless white shirt, his bare feet slapping the cool stone. At the edge of the yard, beyond the shade of the garden trees, black workers move slowly in the heat, carrying buckets, scrubbing, sweeping, keeping the world of the Fischers smooth and invisible. Bram can see them. They cannot look at him for too long. In this house, all the rules of the future apartheid regime already exist, even if the word apartheid has not yet been coined. There is a right door and a wrong door, a right place to sit and a wrong place to stand, a right language, a right God, a right color, and then all the others. At the long dinner table, conversations are serious. Politics, law, the Afrikaner people. There are stories of war, of British camps, of suffering. The message is clear. We were wronged. We must stand together. Trust your own. The rival in Bram's life is born very early. Not a single person, but a whole path laid out for him. The path of loyalty, of respectability, of becoming the son his father expects. An Afrikaner judge, defending order at any cost. But something in Bram never quite fits. At school, at Grey College in Bloemfontein, he stands out. Thick, wavy hair, sharp eyes, a quick, dry sense of humor. He excels at languages, devours history, burns through mathematics. Teachers see a future professor, maybe a prime minister. Classmates see someone they will someday work for. But Bram sees something else. Every morning, he walks past black laborers who built the very city he lives in, but are not allowed to own a piece of it. He hears the way adults talk about the native problem, as if people are a problem to be solved, as if the land is theirs by right, and everyone else is just there, temporary, movable, disposable. He is too young to argue, but he is old enough to notice. On hot afternoons, while other boys dream of rugby glory and business empires, Bram disappears with a book into the shade. He folds the page corners down, where history feels like an accusation. He memorizes facts like a prosecutor preparing a case, only he doesn't know yet who is on trial. At home, the pressure tightens like a belt. Remember who you are, his family reminds him, a Fischer, an Afrikaner, the product of sacrifice, the bearer of a legacy. The conflict is simple and brutal. Tradition versus conscience. Loyalty versus honesty. And right now, tradition is winning. Bram is not a rebel. Not yet. He is polite, clever, dutiful. He works hard. He wins prizes. He does what is expected of him. But every day, the gap between what he sees and what he's told grows a little wider. Then, the first twist. In a family steeped in Afrikaner nationalism, Bram starts reading the wrong books. English novels, radical essays, stories that whisper another version of reality into his carefully structured world. He discovers, slowly, that suffering is not only the property of his own people, that the tragedy of the Afrikaner during the South African War is one chapter in a much larger, uglier book. And then he does something no one expects. He leaves. First to the Grey University College in Bloemfontein, and then further, propelled not by money, though his family is comfortable, but by talent, scholarships, fellowships, the kind of academic excellence that even the most conservative professor cannot ignore. At university, the world widens a little. There are debates, student clubs, newspapers. The air smells less of dust and more of ink, sweat, and possibility. Bram debates formal legal questions by day, Roman Dutch law, precedents, the proper interpretation of statutes, and at night, he turns those same tools onto his society. If this is law, he asks himself, what does justice look like? It is a dangerous question. A new rival appears on the horizon, not yet in the form of a man, but of an idea. The Afrikaner nationalist project that will harden into apartheid. Young men around him talk about our people, about reclaiming power from the English, about building a state where whites rule without apology. They want to capture the machinery of law and use it like a weapon. Bram, quietly, begins to imagine the opposite. In dusty lecture halls, he masters the very instruments that will later be turned against him. Legal argument, command of precedent. The cold, precise language of judges, he learns how to make the unreasonable sound inevitable. His professors predict a glittering legal career. The path is clear. Go to the bar, build a practice, become a judge, sit in the same high-backed chair his father occupies, presiding over other people's fates. And then comes another twist of fate. Bram wins a Rhodes Scholarship. At a time when Rhodes scholars are almost exclusively white and drawn from colonial elites, Bram is the perfect candidate. Afrikaner, aristocracy, legal brilliance, impeccable manners. Cecil Rhodes created the scholarship to bind the empire together through its brightest sons. He could not have guessed that one of those sons would end up dismantling a cornerstone of white power. Bram packs his bags for England. The boat ride north is a slow tearing away. The coastline recedes. The flat, sun-scorched Free State gives way to open sea. On deck, surrounded by young men who speak confidently of empire and destiny, Bram stares at the horizon and feels an unfamiliar sensation. Distance. For the first time, South Africa is not the whole world. It is one country among many, one problem among countless others. Oxford, stone walls darkened by centuries of rain, lawns too green to be real, buildings that look like they were built for gods, not students. Bram walks through quadrangles where prime ministers and judges have shaped their minds for generations, and he realizes he is no longer the heir of a small provincial elite. He is part of something bigger and much more complicated. In lecture halls, he hears brilliant men defend British liberal traditions, freedom, the rule of law, civilized government. Outside, in the streets and newspapers, he reads about India, about Ireland, about workers' strikes and police batons. He sees how the same empire that praises liberty at home crushes it abroad. The contrast cuts deep. He spends evenings in smoky pubs and cramped rooms, listening to conversations that would be unthinkable at his family table. Socialists, communists, pacifists, colonial subjects, voices that question everything. They talk not about native problems, but about capitalism, exploitation, imperialism. The vocabulary is new, but the realities they describe sound familiar. He hears for the first time the idea that race and class are not accidents, but systems, that the law can be used to hide injustice as easily as to expose it. Bram doesn't become a communist overnight. That's not how it works. The transformation is slower, more dangerous. It starts with a crack in certainty, then another, until the whole structure of belief is riddled with questions. He travels to Europe, to the Soviet Union. In Moscow, he sees something he cannot see at home. Black and white students, walking side by side, eating at the same tables, studying under the same roof. It is not a perfect society. He is not blind. He senses the repression, the silence under the surface. At the sight of a black man, not treated as a servant, not forced to step off the pavement, hits him like a physical blow. He realizes that what he was told is natural back home is in fact a choice, and choices can be undone. The clock on Bram's life starts ticking in those years, though he doesn't hear it yet. Every book he reads, every conversation he has, every injustice he recognizes tightens a future noose around his own neck. Because once you see, you cannot unsee, and once you cannot unsee, you must decide. By the time he completes his studies at Oxford, Bram could take an easy path. Stay in Britain, build an academic career, teach law in quiet halls far away from the heat and brutality of his homeland. Many in his position would have done exactly that. He does not. He returns. Johannesburg in the 1930s is a city built on gold and sweat. The mine dumps rise like man-made hills, pale and poisonous. The air tastes of metal. Black workers pour into the city in their thousands, drawn by the promise of wages and trapped by pass laws and police batons. Bram walks into this world as a young advocate, armed with degrees and glowing recommendations. The Johannesburg bar is the arena where his fate will be decided, though he doesn't know it yet. From the outside, he looks exactly like what he was born to be. A white Afrikaner lawyer in a dark suit, briefcase in hand, walking up the steps of the court built to serve men like him. Inside, something else is happening. Case by case, client by client, the contradictions he has been carrying since childhood are dragged into the light. He sees black miners accused of pass violations, a crime created entirely by the state, an offense against a system designed to keep them cheap and controllable. He sees farm laborers beaten, domestic workers abused, trade unionists harassed, and he sees, again and again, how the law, his sacred family inheritance, is bent to justify it all. In the same building, on the same corridors, other young Afrikaner lawyers are making different choices. Some are already aligning themselves with the National Party, with secret committees and smoky back rooms where the blueprint of apartheid is being sketched in harsher lines. They are Bram's professional rivals, competing for the same judge's approval, the same prestige, the same future seats on the bench. They keep their heads down politically, or they lean openly into the rising tide of white nationalism. Bram does the opposite. He starts taking difficult cases, political cases. He represents trade unionists, activists, people whose names never appear in society pages, who are not invited to the polite parties where judges and advocates sip sherry and discuss precedent. Whispers begin. Why is he doing this? He's a Fisher, isn't he? He's jeopardizing his future. At home, the atmosphere shifts. Conversations with his father grow tense. The judge believes in order, in the gradual improvement of society, in the wisdom of the bench. Bram believes the bench is increasingly resting on the necks of the poor. The rivalry in his life sharpens, him versus his own class. And then, in the shadows of Johannesburg's political underground, Bram meets allies who will pull him across a line he can never recross. He meets Molly Kriege, a passionate, intelligent woman from another prominent Afrikaner family with liberal leanings. Molly shares his discomfort with the world they were born into. Their relationship is not just romantic, it is political. Their home will become a meeting place where ideas as dangerous as dynamite are passed around the table as casually as bread. Through Molly, through trade unionists, through black intellectuals and activists, Bram is drawn into the orbit of the Communist Party of South Africa. In the eyes of the state, and in the eyes of his own family, there is nothing more shocking, more shameful. Communists are not just political opponents. They are traitors, enemies, the embodiment of everything the rising Afrikaner nationalist movement fears: interracial solidarity, workers' power, an end to white supremacy. For a man with Bram's background to even speak to them is scandalous. To join them, unthinkable, but the unthinkable becomes inevitable. Night after night, in small rooms thick with cigarette smoke, Bram argues, listens, tests his beliefs. He does not accept the party line blindly. He brings his legal mind to every slogan, every program. Is this practical? Is this just? What does it look like in a courtroom, in a law, in a life? The more he listens, the more he sees that the communists are almost alone among whites in taking black South Africans seriously as political equals, as partners rather than problems. They speak clumsily sometimes, honestly often, of a future where race is not a sentence. He thinks of the black workers in his childhood yard, of the men in the dock he has defended, condemned not by their actions, but by their skin and their poverty, of the judges, including his own father, upholding a system that calls itself justice. And he makes a decision. Somewhere in Johannesburg, in a plain room, Bram Fischer writes his name on a piece of paper. It is a small action, physically, a few strokes of ink. Politically, morally, personally, it is a detonation. He becomes a member of the Communist Party of South Africa. At that moment, the slow, invisible race between him and his future rival, men like Percy Utah, like the architects and servants of apartheid, enters a new phase. They do not know each other yet. They have not crossed swords in court, but they are already on opposite sides of a line that will decide their lives. The clock on Bram's freedom starts ticking louder. From this point on, every success in his legal career, every new contact, every piece of insider knowledge he gains is a weapon he can choose to turn against the state, and every step closer to the day when the state will turn all its attention on him. The boy from Bloemfontein, raised under the stern gaze of judges and prime ministers' portraits, has chosen treason in the name of justice, and time is running out. In a country where the law is a cage, the most dangerous man is not the one with a gun in his hand, but the one who refuses to use that law the way he's told. Bram Fischer stands in his dim Johannesburg flat, the second hand on the wall clock sawing away the last minutes of his freedom. The stack of papers in front of him is not just evidence, it is a map of an underground army. Safe houses, false names, routes through the townships, the veins and arteries of a movement the state is desperate to cut. Across the city, under cold fluorescent lights, Percy Utah bends over another table piled with files. Where Bram sees lives, Utah sees targets. Where Bram sees comrades, Utah sees trophies. He sharpens his pencil the way another man might sharpen a knife. They have not always been this close, this aware of each other. But for years now, they have been walking toward this collision. Step by step, case by case, judgment by judgment. The clock on the wall ticks. Bram does not flinch. He has been living on borrowed time for a very long while. Decades earlier, when he signed his name on that Communist Party card, he thought he was stepping into a new world of ideas. He did not yet understand that he was also stepping into an arena, and that on the other side of that arena, the state would one day send its most ambitious gladiator. For a while, the descent into illegality is almost invisible. Bram's legal career explodes. He becomes one of the brightest advocates at the Johannesburg bar. Judges quote his arguments in their rulings. Senior silks ask him to handle complex appeals. In the corridors of power, his surname still opens doors. Fischer means reliability, intellect, pedigree, but in smoke-filled back rooms and cramped township houses, the same man is learning how to live a double life. By day, he is the impeccably dressed counsel arguing over the fine points of statute. By night, he sits on wooden chairs pushed close together, surrounded by trade unionists, black activists, Indian organizers, colored intellectuals. They talk of strikes, of protests, of leaflets to be printed, of police spies to be avoided. In those rooms, he is not Advocate Fischer, but Comrade Bram. Then 1948 hits like a hammer. The National Party wins the election. Overnight, the vague, ugly racial practices of the past harden into a declared ideology. Apartheid, laws begin to pour out of Parliament like concrete, filling every crack in daily life. Population registration, group areas, separate amenities, a legal wall between black and white, brick by brick. Bram reads the new acts the day they are printed. On the surface, they are dry, technical, written in the bloodless language of administration. He sees, in every clause, the chains being fitted more tightly. Where others in his class celebrate, he feels the air change. The state is no longer merely unjust. It is becoming total. In the same years, another young lawyer is finding his feet. Percy, Utah. Brilliant, ambitious, excellent memory for detail. Where Bram sees the law as a tool to pry open the system, Utah sees it as a ladder. He chooses the side that promises power now, not justice later. He joins the state prosecution service, aligning himself with the rising tide of Afrikaner nationalism. He hears the name Fischer, whispered with respect in legal circles. At first, Bram is simply a rival to be watched, maybe surpassed. It will take years of tightening repression before Utah understands that this rival is not just a competitor, but an obstacle to be crushed. The battlefield between them is a courtroom. Bram's name begins to appear in political cases. He defends black workers arrested during strikes, activists charged under pass laws, union leaders accused of incitement. In overcrowded courtrooms that smell of sweat and fear, the accused sit shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, faces turned toward the one white advocate willing to stand beside them. Sometimes, the victories are small. A reduced sentence, a technical acquittal, a postponed deportation. Sometimes, against all odds, the charges collapse, and men walk free who were already counting the days to prison. Word spreads. In the townships, people start saying, half with disbelief, "There's an Afrikaner advocate who will actually fight for you." In the polished clubs of the white elite, the same sentence is said with disgust. At home, Bram and Molly try to hold together something like a normal life. There is laughter around the dinner table, children's voices, the rattle of cups. But even their living room becomes a front line. Banned literature appears and disappears. Notes are burned in the fireplace. Visitors knock in coded patterns. Then comes 1950. The Communist Party of South Africa is banned. Its offices are raided, its public existence wiped off the map with the stroke of a pen. In the government's imagination, that should be the end of it. In reality, it is the beginning of something far more dangerous. The party goes underground. Bram, with his legal mind and his network of contacts, moves quickly into its inner core. The fact that a man of his standing is willing to lead this new clandestine structure shocks even some of his comrades. He knows what he is risking more clearly than anyone. He has read the punishments in the statute books himself. Meetings now happen behind drawn curtains, in whispered code. The faces around the table grow more diverse. Black organizers from the African National Congress, Indian activists from the Transvaal, Indian Congress, colored leaders from the Cape. They are building what will become the Congress Alliance, a multiracial front that dares to imagine a South Africa that belongs to all who live in it. To most white South Africans, it is treason. To Bram, it is the first honest political idea he has ever believed in. The Alliance's belief in non-racial democracy takes physical form in 1955 on a dusty field in Kliptown. The Congress of the People gathers. Thousands of delegates from across the country, watched by nervous policemen and suspicious informers. Bram stands in the crowd, one of very few white Afrikaners there, listening as the Freedom Charter is read aloud. The people shall govern. He shall enjoy equal human rights. The doors of learning and culture shall be opened. In that moment, under the open sky, surrounded by people who have been treated as invisible all his life, Bram feels something like a verdict being handed down on his own class. His grandfather's republic, his father's judiciary, the polite dinner tables of his youth, all weighed against these simple demands and found wanting. The state's response is swift. In 1956, in the early hours of a cold morning, police fan out across the country. 156 leaders of the Congress Alliance are arrested and charged with high treason. It is a breathtaking move. Almost the entire public leadership of the opposition in one dock: Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Albert Luthuli, Yusuf Dadoo, Ruth First, men and women whose names will later be chiseled into history books, now standing in a long line for fingerprinting like common criminals. Bram joins the legal team that will defend them. For years, almost 5, the treason trial drags on. The indictment alone is thousands of pages long, a legal bludgeon meant to sap energy and resources. The prosecution tries to prove that the Freedom Charter is a blueprint for violent revolution. In court, the drama is extraordinary. On one side, a state determined to criminalize the very idea of equality. On the other, a mixed team of white and black lawyers, with Bram as one of its sharpest strategists, unpacking, dissecting, turning the state's own witnesses against it. Night after night, he pores over transcripts, his eyes burning, his fingers blackened with ink. He walks into court each morning, looking composed, every question precisely prepared, every objection ready. Behind that calm, the stakes are clear. If the state succeeds, any call for democracy can be labeled treason. Eventually, the prosecution's case collapses. In 1961, the accused are acquitted. It is a victory that sends ripples of hope through the townships and the underground. But it is also a warning. The state has learned. It has seen how difficult it is to turn ideas into criminal acts in the eyes of even conservative judges. So it changes tactics. No more sprawling treason trials. From now on, it will strike more surgically. Shorter charges, sharper laws, harsher detention powers, and away from the public eye, the violence escalates. In March 1960, in the township of Sharpeville, police opened fire on a peaceful crowd protesting the passed laws. 69 people are killed, many shot in the back as they flee. Children lie face down in the dust, schoolbooks scattered, blood soaking into their pages. Bram reads the reports, sees the photographs. The law he was raised to revere has become an accomplice to slaughter. The government declares a state of emergency. Thousands are detained without trial. The ANC and Paki are banned. The space for legal protest shrinks to almost nothing. Within the Congress alliance, a painful debate erupts. If peaceful protest is met with bullets, what options remain? The ANC forms Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation, an armed wing that will sabotage symbols of apartheid, power lines, military installations, government offices, avoiding, as far as possible, loss of life. Bram is no romantic about violence. He knows exactly what it will cost, not only in human lives, but in political legitimacy. As a lawyer, he instinctively reaches for arguments, for negotiations, for precedents. But as a communist and a strategist, he cannot ignore reality. A regime that massacres unarmed protesters has left them little else. Reluctantly, grimly, he supports the decision. Quietly, he helps to give the embryonic armed struggle a legal mind. How to understand international law, how to think about sabotage, rather than terrorism, how to craft arguments that might one day stand in a courtroom. He does not yet know that those arguments will be tested far sooner than he imagines. By now, his name is in every security file. He is a banned person, his movements restricted, his speeches forbidden. But banning orders are just ink on paper. Bram finds ways around them. He appears in court when he technically should not. He attends meetings that technically do not exist. In an office somewhere in Pretoria, Percy Utah flips through a file with Bram's name on the cover and feels a cold, precise anger. The treason trial acquittals have humiliated the state. The rise of sabotage has humiliated it further. Utah believes the answer lies not in politics, but in a perfect prosecution, a case so watertight that no judge will dare to acquit. Soon, he will get his chance. July 1963. A quiet farm in Rivonia, north of Johannesburg. To the neighbors, it is just another property with trees and a thatched house. In reality, Liliesleaf Farm is the secret headquarters of the underground. Here, leaders of the ANC and Communist Party meet in relative safety, planning operations, writing documents, hiding from the net tightening around them. On a winter afternoon, the police strike. Armored vehicles crunch up the driveway. Men with guns fan out across the property. Inside, around a table, leaders look up in disbelief as the door is flung open. Papers flap in the sudden draft. Typewriters sit abandoned, pages still in the carriage. They are caught almost literally red-handed. The raid on Rivonia is a goldmine for the prosecution. Documents are seized by the armful. Diaries, minutes of meetings, draft strategies, concrete plans for sabotage. Among them is a blueprint for a possible future insurrection, codenamed Operation Mayibuye. To the state, it is proof that the accused were plotting full-scale revolution. The file that lands on Percy Utah's desk is everything he has been waiting for. Mandela, already in prison for earlier offenses, is added to the list. With him, Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Ahmed Kathrada, and others. The state wants nothing less than their deaths, publicly, legally, as a warning, and the man chosen to lead their defense? Bram Fischer. The irony is almost unbearable. The underground leader, still undetected as such by the state, now walks openly into court as senior counsel for the very men whose secret meetings he has attended, whose strategies he has helped shape. He is playing a double game at a table where the stakes are life and death. In the Rivonia courtroom, the air crackles. On one side, Utah, meticulous, theatrical, rising through the ranks of the security establishment. He lays out the state's case with an almost chilly relish. Photographs, seized documents, witnesses intimidated into testimony. He speaks of bombs, of foreign communism, of danger to civilized government. On the other, Bram, grey at the temples now, tired around the eyes, but with a mind as sharp as ever. He could choose a purely technical defense, challenge procedures, poke holes in the chain of evidence, try to wriggle through the gaps. Instead, he and his team make a far more dangerous choice. They turn the trial into a platform. Mandela stands in the dock and delivers his now legendary speech. "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society." His voice carries beyond the courtroom walls, beyond South Africa's borders, into the ears of a watching world. Bram has helped create the legal conditions for that speech, argued for the right of the accused to speak for themselves. Utah is furious. He wants a neat, clinical prosecution, not a global spectacle. As the weeks pass, the tension mounts. Witness after witness, document after document. Utah paints the accused as ruthless conspirators. Bram counters with context. Sharpeville, banning orders, the impossibility of peaceful protest. He argues that when a state denies its citizens basic rights, it cannot be surprised when they resist. In private, he tells friends, "We are not fighting for acquittal. We are fighting for their lives." The clock is ticking again. Only this time, the deadline is measured in court days. In his closing argument, Utah demands the ultimate punishment. He speaks of deterrence, of protecting the nation, of the need to show strength. Between the lines, his ambition glows. If he secures death sentences for Mandela and his comrades, his place in the apartheid pantheon is assured. Bram rises to reply, knowing he is perhaps the last thin line between his clients and the gallows. He does not plead innocence. The facts of sabotage are too strong. Instead, he pleads humanity. He invokes British legal tradition, the very liberal values the apartheid state claims as its heritage. He reminds the judge that the death penalty, once imposed, cannot be undone. He suggests, carefully but unmistakably, that hanging these men will turn them into martyrs the world will never forget. He speaks not just as an advocate, but as a man who knows these accused, who has sat with them in secret rooms, who has watched them wrestle with impossible choices. The courtroom is silent. When the judge, Quartus DeWitt, finally returns to deliver his verdict in June 1964, the tension is so thick it feels almost physical. The accused stand. Their families hold their breath. Journalists grip their pens. Each of the accused is found guilty. The words fall like blows. Then comes the moment that will define the rest of Bram's life. For the offense of sabotage, for acts that in many jurisdictions would mean death, the judge pronounces instead life imprisonment. Not the gallows, bars, Robben Island, decades behind stone and steel. In the gallery, a suppressed sob breaks into a wail. Some relatives faint. Others collapse into chairs, overwhelmed by a twisted mixture of relief and grief. Their loved ones will live, but they will be buried alive. Bram feels his knees weaken for a heartbeat. He has won, and he has lost. He has saved his clients' necks, and he has helped send them into a living tomb. Across the room, Percy Utah's jaw tightens. In his mind, he has been robbed of a full victory. No ropes, no bodies swinging publicly as an example, just long sentences out of sight. It is not enough. He turns his attention, with a prosecutor's cold focus, to the man who, he believes, made the difference. Bram Fischer. After Rivonia, the net closes. The security police, humiliated that the underground leadership survived as long as it did, are determined that no such network will ever exist again. Banned people are watched more closely. Phones are tapped. Letters opened. Informers recruited. The blow that did not land on Mandela and his comrades is now redirected. Bram knows it. He walks out of that courtroom not as a celebrated advocate, but as a marked man. At home, he and Molly sit at the same table that has hosted so many secret meetings. The mood is different now, heavier, the clock louder. He is already under a suspended sentence from an earlier minor offense. The authorities are circling with new charges, violating banning orders, further illegal activities. Comrades urge him to leave the country while he can. He could slip away, take a post overseas, continue the struggle from exile. The prospect of safety is real. So is the temptation. But he looks around at the city outside his window, the mine dumps, the townships, the court where he has argued, the prisons now, holding his friends, and makes another decision that will shock even those who think they know him. He refuses to run. Instead, he chooses the most dangerous path imaginable. He will go underground inside South Africa itself, live under a false name, move between safe houses, lead what remains of the underground from within the jaws of the beast. The door of his old life begins to close. Back in the present, in that quiet flat with the ticking clock, the last scraps of paper lie on the table in front of him. Years of struggle compressed into a few pages of names and numbers. Bram picks one up, feels the thinness of the sheet between his fingers, and understands with a lawyer's clarity what they would mean in evidence. Outside, a car slows. He hears footsteps in the stairwell. Somewhere else in the city, Percy Utah straightens his tie, ready to turn one more key in the machinery he has helped construct. The rivalry that began in lecture halls and court corridors is now a race against a lock, a bolt, a door about to be shattered. Bram Fischer takes a breath, reaches for the matches, and chooses, once again, how his story will be written, in ink or in ash. Most fugitives spend their last free hours running. Bram Fischer spends his burning every road that could still save him. The match flares, staining his fingers orange. The pages curl, blacken, vanish. Names of comrades, addresses of safe houses, dates for meetings that will never happen now, all dissolve into a greasy column of smoke that claws at the ceiling. The room fills with the sour smell of scorched paper and ink, as if years of plotting and hope are being cremated in a single night. Down in the street, a car door slams. He does not look out of the window. Looking is panic. He has no time for panic. He checks the last bag by the door instead. One change of clothes, a razor, a cheap pair of glasses, a battered book of Afrikaans poetry. Not much for a man who, on paper, still owns a respectable house, a good practice, a seat at polished dinner tables. On paper. The clock on the wall stammers toward the hour he is supposed to report to the authorities. When that hand crosses that line, he will officially become something South African law despises more than almost anything. A white man who has chosen to break ranks. The last embers die in the ashtray. Bram slips on his coat, pockets the fake identity card with its lie of a name, and steps into the corridor. Behind him, the flat is already changing from a headquarters into a crime scene. He moves quickly, but not too quickly, down the stairs. A neighbor coming up nods, sees an ordinary middle-aged man with a worn briefcase. Not the advocate who has just saved Nelson Mandela from the gallows. Not the communist whose file lies thick on security police desks. Just another face in a city full of faces. On the landing, Bram hears it. The distant growl of an engine that does not quite sound like a normal car. Heavy, deliberate. A special branch vehicle has its own kind of accent. Somewhere inside him, a small muscle tightens. He does not speed up. He cannot afford to draw even a single extra glance. He steps out onto the pavement and turns left into the flow of pedestrians. 3 minutes later, half a block away, a dark sedan pulls up outside his building. Men get out. They straighten their jackets in the cold morning air. They walk in with the stiff, rehearsed gait of people who expect doors to open, people who believe the law walks with them like an invisible bodyguard. They are late by the length of a cigarette. For the next few weeks, Bram lives like a ghost in his own city. His new name, The one on the false papers is plain, forgettable. That is the point. He checks into a cheap boarding house as a traveling salesman, the landlady barely looking up as she slides the register toward him. The room is narrow, the bed too short, the mattress bowed. The wallpaper peels in long scars. On the wall, a framed print of a ship at sea hangs crooked, as if the ship is sliding off the world. He lies awake and listens to the sounds of Johannesburg through thin walls, a baby crying, a radio murmuring the evening news, the wet cough of a man in the next room. Somewhere above it all, the high whine of a police siren curls and fades. Every sound is now a question. Is it coming for me? By day, he takes trams and buses under his new identity, moving from apartment to apartment, safe house to safe house. In one, he meets a handful of young activists, eyes bright and reckless, scarcely believing that the legendary advocate is now living, like they do, with a packed bag always within reach. In another, he sits with older comrades at a kitchen table, the oilcloth worn thin at the elbows, and they redraw the map of their shattered underground. The Rivonia arrests have gutted the leadership. The organizations that once met in crowded, noisy offices now fit around 3 wooden chairs and a single flickering bulb. "We have 6 months," one comrade says, tracing circles on the table with a spoon. "Maybe less, before they pick off the rest of us." Bram looks at the calendar on the wall. He has less than that. The date of his postponed court appearance is ringed in red, an appointment he has no intention of keeping. The moment he fails to show, the state will stop pretending it is dealing with a mere troublesome advocate. It will declare him what he has already become, a hunted man. Time is not just passing. It is closing in. He works furiously, as if he can outrun the clock by sheer concentration. He drafts internal documents for the underground Communist Party, sharpening strategy, arguing for tighter cells, better security. He writes letters to exiled comrades that will be smuggled across borders in false bottoms of suitcases. At night, by the dim light of a bedside lamp, he rewrites his own life in his head, who he used to be, who he chose to become, and the gap between those men. Sometimes, in these sleepless hours, old images flicker up without warning. His father in judicial robes, face grave, hands steady, the young Bram at Oxford, arguing about fairness and justice in rooms where no one's freedom is actually at stake. The courtroom at Rivonia, Mandela's voice filling the air like a verdict on them all. Now, instead of addressing a judge, he talks to the cracked ceiling. "What did you think this would lead to?" he asks his younger self. The one who signed that card in the Communist Party office decades ago, with steady hand and clear conscience. The ceiling does not answer. He cannot stay in Johannesburg forever. The net here is too tight. Special Branch has too many informers, too many eyes. So he moves, not across borders, but across lines on a map that mean almost as much in apartheid South Africa. From city to city, white suburbs to grey industrial streets, respectable hotels to back rooms above shebeens where the smell of beer and sweat seeps into his clothes. In Bloemfontein, his birthplace, he walks past the courthouse where his father once presided. He passes within 20 meters of a big bronze statue honoring the heroes of the Anglo-Boer War. No one pauses, no one points. No one sees that the son of one of their legal lions is slipping by with his collar turned up, hiding not just his face, but his entire history. In a cheap cafe, his hands wrapped around a chipped cup of coffee, he hears 2 Afrikaner farmers at the next table discussing him. "Fischer," one says, rolling the name in his mouth like a bad taste. "Traitor, they should have hanged him with Mandela." "They will catch him," the other replies. "They always catch them in the end." Bram feels the remark like a hand on his shoulder. Not because it is wrong, but because it is so probably right. The state, meanwhile, is tightening its own schedule. In Pretoria, security chiefs sit around a polished table, the air thick with smoke and resentment. Rivonia did not deliver the clean, deadly spectacle they wanted. They have given Mandela and his comrades a kind of twisted immortality instead of extinction. They need a different kind of trophy now. Percy Utah stands at the window, looking down at the neat lawns and the guard at the gate. He has climbed higher since Rivonia. His name carries more weight in official circles, but inside, something still gnaws. The life sentences have branded him a victor in the newspapers, yet he knows, in the dark honesty of his own ambition, that it was not the victory he sought. "Find Fischer," he says to the officers gathered behind him, his voice casual, almost lazy. "You bring me Fischer, and I will do what the judge did not dare in Rivonia. I will finish the story properly." They nod, some uneasily. Even among apartheid's enforcers, the prospect of breaking a man of Bram's stature carries its own weight. An Afrikaner, from a family like his, turning against his own, it unsettles them the way a crack in a dam wall unsettles villagers downstream. The race is now open. One night, months into his fugitive life, Bram almost loses it without a single policeman lifting a finger. It happens in the stupidest, most ordinary way. He is in a small town, driving back from a clandestine meeting. The roads almost empty. The sky is a lid of stars, the air clear and cold. His thoughts drift, always dangerous for a man in his position, back to Molly, to his children, to the quiet, stubborn pain he sees in their faces when he does manage to send a message. A curve in the road comes up quicker than he expects. His tired hands react a fraction too late. The car skids. Gravel spits from under the tires. The headlights swing across the veld, slicing the dark, then slam back toward the ditch. There is the sickening metallic thump of impact, the sudden unreasonable pause afterward when the world seems to inhale. He is not badly hurt. A cut on his forehead. Bruised ribs. The radiator hisses like an angry thing. He climbs out, cursing his own carelessness, and stands in the middle of the road. The cool night air, thick with the smell of leaking petrol. Far off, blue lights bloom. He could try to run, limp into the veld, disappear into the dark. But there is nowhere to go, no cover, and running would draw attention faster than anything else. So he does what his whole life has trained him to do. He straightens his shoulders, wipes the blood from his brow with a handkerchief, and prepares to argue. The police car pulls up, tires crunching. Two officers step out, uniforms creaking. One shines a flashlight in his face. "Evening, sir," the man says. The word sir, more habit than respect. "Looks like you had a bit of trouble." Bram offers a weak, embarrassed smile. He gives the false name on his papers, passes them over with steady hands. The beam of light slides from his face to the identity card, then back again. For a long moment, no one speaks. The older of the two officers narrows his eyes. Somewhere, ingrained deep, a memory stirs. A photograph in a newspaper, a court sketch, a wanted notice, pinned up in a station. The same high forehead, the same angular jaw. It is as if two images are trying to align in his head. "Everything all right, Sergeant?" his younger colleague asks, impatient, cold, seeping through his boots. The older man keeps staring. Then, slowly, something hardens in his pupils. "Yes," he says softly, "everything is very all right." He hands the ID back with a new kind of care, as if it might be evidence. Bram feels the shift before he sees it. The officer's posture changes. Their politeness becomes precise, official, edged. "Would you mind coming with us to the station, Mr. Black?" the older one says, using the false surname with a slight stress that makes it sound like an accusation. It is over in 5 minutes. Months of evasion ended by a patch of loose gravel and a police sergeant with a good memory. At the station, under harsh fluorescent lights, the mask comes off quickly. The questions are sharper now, the tone insulting. They take his fingerprints, and the machine of the state whirs to life. A match comes through, as inevitable as sunrise. The name on their forms changes. Douglas Black is crossed out. Bram Fischer is written in block letters. In Pretoria, the news travels fast. The phone rings on Percy Utah's desk. He listens, and the faint smile that creeps across his face is not the smile of a man amused. It is the thin, satisfied line of someone watching a trap finally snap shut. There are rules, even in this system, about how quickly a man must be charged, how soon he must be brought before a magistrate. But rules here are elastic for some, steel for others. They hold Bram just long enough in an interrogation room that smells of sweat and disinfectant, long enough to let fatigue and isolation do their work. "Why, Fisher?" an officer demands, pacing. "You had everything. Name, money, respect. Why throw it away for a bunch of Kafir communists?" Bram does not answer. Not because he is brave in every moment, no one is, but because he has decided, in a place deep inside, that no one in this room can reach, that he will spend the last of his time choosing his words, not reacting to theirs. When they finally charge him, the list is impressive, in the way that a pile of stones can be impressive when you realize each one will be tied to your ankles. Conspiracy to commit sabotage, membership of a banned organization, furthering the aims of communism, violating banning orders. They want not just to imprison him, but to define him permanently in the language of criminality. They want to turn Bram Fischer from a respected legal name into a cautionary tale told in white living rooms. This is what happens when one of us betrays us. The trial that follows is both familiar and utterly strange. Familiar because he has walked into courts his whole adult life, felt the dry smell of old wood and paper, the weight of the judge's glance from the bench. Strange because now he is not in the robed ranks of counsel, but in the dock, the wooden barrier that says to everyone in the room, "Here stands the accused." The press benches are full. The public gallery holds an odd mix. Black activists who manage to avoid detention. White liberals shifting uncomfortably. Members of Bram's own family staring ahead as if the only way not to break is to see nothing. And there, near the front, sits Percy Utah. He is not the lead prosecutor this time. That task has been delegated, but he is present. His presence itself, a message. He watches the man who thwarted him at Rivonia with the cold curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen under glass. "You used the courtroom against us then," his eyes seem to say. "Let's see what you do now. When you are the one in the cage." The state's case is strong in the way that repression is strong. Broad, heavy, seemingly irresistible. They pile up witnesses, seize documents, surveillance reports. They tie Bram to meetings, to pamphlets, to coded correspondence. They resurrect old speeches and articles, twist his words into a rope. His own lawyers, comrades and colleagues, advise a narrow defense, challenge the most serious charges, admit what must be admitted, contest what can be contested, emphasize his age, his service, his previous standing, play the game as it is supposed to be played if you want to walk out with anything less than a lifetime behind bars. But each night, after court adjourns, sitting alone in his cell, Bram feels the seconds sliding away more loudly than the judge's gavel. This is, he knows, probably his last major case, and it is his own. One evening, his counsel brings him a message, relayed through channels so murky no one can say exactly where it began. If he cooperates, the message suggests, if he distances himself from the communists, from the ANC, if he expresses regret, there may be room for leniency, perhaps not freedom, but a lighter term, perhaps in time, even exile. It is not an official offer, nothing that could ever be quoted in court. It is more like a hint of a door, half open in a corridor full of locked cells. For a moment, the image is intoxicating. Exile means distance from the beatings, the concrete, the narrow beds. It means writing, organizing, seeing his children grow into something more than photographs aging in his hands. He turns the idea over, once, twice, like a coin between his fingers. Then he sees, as clearly as if it were written on the cell wall, the price. Silence in the face of what he has seen. Retreat from people who have no door, no offer, no passport. A confession that says to every black comrade, every banned activist, when it became truly dangerous, the Afrikaner from Bloemfontein chose his own skin over your freedom. He writes a brief note on prison-issue paper, his handwriting cramped but firm. I cannot ask for mercy for holding to principles I believe just. To do so would be to say that I was wrong to fight apartheid. I was not wrong. The next day, in court, he makes his decision visible. Instead of allowing his lawyers to close the case in their professional, technical way, he rises in the dock and asks permission to address the court personally. The judge hesitates. He remembers Mandela's speech at Rivonia, how it slipped the bonds of the trial and entered history. Another platform, he thinks, another performance. But to deny a man like Fischer the right to speak at his own trial would be a step even an apartheid judge thinks twice about. The illusion of fairness must be preserved. Very well, the judge says stiffly. You may proceed. Bram's hands tremble slightly as he unfolds the pages he has been writing at night. The courtroom seems to lean forward. He does not plead innocence. He does not pretend to be a misunderstood lawyer who stumbled by accident into the wrong meetings. He speaks of injustice, of laws used as weapons, of a system so total that any decent person must choose between complicity and resistance. I did not lightly abandon the traditions into which I was born, he says, his voice steady now, but when the laws of my own people became instruments of cruelty and humiliation, I could not in good conscience stand aside. I have done what I believed was my duty as a man and as a South African. The words are not shouted, not theatrical. They are measured, almost quiet. That makes them more dangerous. He invokes his Afrikaner heritage not as a shield, but as an accusation. He talks about how his grandfather fought for a republic, how his father served justice, how the dream of freedom that animated those earlier struggles has been perverted into a nightmare of racial domination. There comes a point, he says, when obedience to unjust laws becomes itself a moral wrong. I reached that point years ago. I do not regret that I chose to resist. In the gallery, someone begins to cry, the sound thin and keening. Another person, a young black man in a worn suit, presses his fist hard against his mouth as if to keep something inside from breaking loose. Utah watches, jaw clenched. He can feel it happening again. The courtroom slipping out of the state's control, becoming a mirror held up to its face. But this time, there is a difference. The man speaking will not be sent to an island whose name will become a symbol. He will not become the global figurehead of a movement. He will be buried deeper, in smaller cells, his name spoken more quietly, if at all. That, Utah tells himself, is something that is still a kind of victory. When Bram finishes, there is a silence that feels longer than it is. The judge looks down at the papers in front of him, at his notes, at the statutes that have been invoked and re-invoked. He looks up at the man in the dock who has, with a few pages of handwritten text, turned this case from a tidy prosecution into another moral reckoning. I must sentence you, he says finally, not as you see yourself, but as the law requires. The words that follow are familiar now. Years of defending others have trained Bram's ears to the rhythms of sentencing. But it is another thing entirely when those words coil around your own name. The judge lists the counts, the maximums, the reasons. He acknowledges briefly Fischer's standing, his past service, Then he sweeps it all aside with a single phrase. In view of the gravity of these offenses and your central role in furthering the aims of communism and sabotage, this court has no option but to impose the severest penalties. Life imprisonment. The syllables land like a door slamming in an empty house. In the gallery, there is movement. A woman half rises, then sinks back, her face white and rigid. A reporter scribbles furiously, his pen scratching across paper like a tiny, frantic insect. One of Bram's comrades closes his eyes and nods, very slightly, as if in confirmation of something they both knew was coming. Bram's shoulders sag for a fraction of a second. Then he straightens. A strange calm settles over him, the calm of a man who has finally reached the end of the road he chose years ago, when it still looked like a quiet path through well-tended gardens. He turns, just once, to look at the people in the gallery. His gaze finds Molly. Their eyes meet. Two people who have shared a life now separated by a few meters and an entire system. He allows himself the smallest, tenderest smile. Then the warders take his arms. They lead him down from the dock, through the little door that separates the theater of justice from the machinery of punishment. The air changes immediately, less polished, more metallic. The corridors smell of disinfectant and old fear. Somewhere ahead, a cell waits, its dimensions already measured, its bars already cold. Time has run out for Bram Fischer as an advocate, as a man who can still choose which courtroom to walk into and when. But in another sense, his time is about to stretch, slow, and harden into something else entirely. Years counted, not in cases won or lost, but in the length of shadows on a concrete floor. Behind him, in the almost empty courtroom, Percy Utah picks up his hat and gloves with careful precision. He steps out into the weak Pretoria sunlight, feeling for a moment that he has finally pulled ahead in a race that has lasted more than a decade. He cannot see, not yet, that history keeps its own scorecard, and somewhere, in a prison that still smells of fresh paint and old stone, a door clanks shut on Bram Fischer, marking the start of a sentence that will test not just his body, but the very ideas he chose to give up everything for. They think life imprisonment means they've taken all the time in the world from him. They don't know that inside Bram Fischer's body, a much crueler clock has already started to tick, a clock that will run out long before his sentence does. The first night in Pretoria prison, time shrinks to the size of a cell. The door slams behind him with a metallic finality that no judge's sentence can quite match. The air is cold, sour with disinfectant and old sweat. The walls are a dirty, sweating white, close enough to touch both at once if he spreads his arms. They take his clothes. They take his watch. They take his belt and his shoelaces as if he is a danger to himself as well as to the state. They give him a rough uniform that smells of someone else's fear, and a prison number that fits uneasily over a name that once opened every door in the legal world. He stands in front of a tiny mirror bolted to the wall. The man who looks back is still recognizably Bram Fischer. The high forehead, the angular jaw, the steady, intelligent eyes. But there is something new now, a faint, stunned emptiness behind the pupils, like a courtroom after everyone has gone home. Lights out comes early. The corridor fills with the scrape of boots, the bang of doors, the shouted orders that reduce hundreds of individual lives to a single drilled routine. Somewhere down the block, a man begins to sing softly in Afrikaans, the melody cracked and thin. Another voice, deeper, picks up the tune in Xhosa. For a few seconds, fragile harmony floats in the stale air. Then a warder barks a command, and the voices fall silent. Bram lies on the narrow bunk, the mattress thin as paper beneath his shoulders, and counts the seconds between the footsteps of the guard on night patrol. 5, 6, 7. The rhythm repeats over and over until it stops being a sound and becomes a kind of metronome for his thoughts. Life imprisonment. South African law has turned his future into an unbroken corridor of days that all look like this one. But he knows something the judge did not mention when he pronounced those words. His family history is full of short lives. His father died relatively young. His own health has never been robust. Time for Bram has never been unlimited. Now it has been locked in a box with him. The next weeks harden into a routine designed to grind down anything resembling an inner life. Roll call in the grey half-light of morning. Weak tea in tin cups, porridge that tastes of metal, exercise periods in a concrete yard, high walls hemming in a rectangle of washed-out sky. Everything watched by eyes that never quite blink. There is a separate section for politicals, but the state likes to mix categories when it suits it. Bram finds himself sharing space with thieves, smugglers, a man who stabbed someone in a bar fight and now moves like a ghost, always looking at his own hands. There are also other political prisoners, black and white, band activists and trade unionists, and men who were caught handing out leaflets at bus stops. At first, some of them just stare at him. They have heard the name. The man who stood in court and argued for Mandela's life. The Afrikaner advocate who crossed the line. The communist from a Bloemfontein dynasty that should, by all the rules of this country, have protected him forever. Now he lines up with them for watery soup, clutches his blanket against the drafts at night, just as they do. The equalizing effect of prison is brutal, but it is also, in a quiet, subversive way, exactly what he once argued for in court. A place where the fiction of white superiority cracks under the weight of reality. He does not waste days. He studies the prison regulations as if they are another set of statutes to be interpreted and, where possible, bent. He files complaints, carefully worded, with references to sections and subsections that most warders have never bothered to read. He helps fellow prisoners write appeals, applications, letters to distant families. In the yard, he becomes a one-man university. He explains to a group of young black prisoners what the Suppression of Communism Act actually says and how it has been stretched, like glue over anyone the state dislikes. He talks about the Freedom Charter in a low voice, checking always for the nearest pair of boots. He teaches scraps of Latin legal phrases to men who will never see the inside of a university lecture hall, and watches their faces light up with the strange pleasure of new words. Why do you still bother? One of them asks one day, when a warder has just torn up yet another carefully drafted petition and dropped the shreds in the dirt between them. Because they are counting on us to stop bothering, Bram says. That is how they win. One day, these papers will matter. If not for you, for someone who comes after. Every small act of defiance is another move in the same long contest he has always been playing. The courtroom walls have changed, the judges' robes have been replaced with khaki uniforms and truncheons, but the opponent is the same, a system that insists it has all the time and power in the world. Outside, life continues. New laws are passed, new arrests are made. The security police refine their methods. In an office in Pretoria, Percy Utah reads brief reports about Fischer's conduct in prison. The petitions, the quiet lessons in the yard, the refusal to show contrition, and feels a familiar pulse of irritation. He had hoped, perhaps even expected, that the sentence would break the man who outmaneuvered him at Rivonia, that the weight of the years ahead would bend Bram's spine, dull his gaze, turn him into a cautionary exhibit. Here is what happens to traitors. Instead, the reports speak of continued ideological stubbornness, unrepentant attitude, persistent attempts to influence other inmates. You see, he remarks to a colleague one afternoon, tapping the file. Even in a cell, he wants to run a court. He cannot help himself. But there is something else in his voice now, something uneasily close to reluctant respect. The rivalry that once played out in polished courtrooms has shifted to a different arena, and the stakes have changed. One man has his freedom, his career, his social position. The other has a bunk, a number, a window the size of a sheet of paper. And yet, it is Bram who still seems to be moving pieces on the board. The years begin to mark him. At first, it is small things, a cough that lingers through winter, a stiffness in his jaw when he chews the coarse bread. He loses weight he cannot afford to lose. The already thin face becomes more gaunt, the hollows under his cheekbones darkening into bruised shadows. He asks to see a doctor. The prison staff, trained to suspect every request, shrug. Everyone wants something in here. A transfer, a lighter duty, a painkiller that doesn't taste like chalk. When he finally gets to the infirmary, the fluorescent lights seem too bright. The doctor examines him with the tired, guarded manner of someone who has seen more suffering than he can admit to himself at breakfast. "How long have you had this pain?" the doctor asks, pressing gently along the line of Bram's jaw. "A while," Bram says. Time in prison is not measured in days or weeks anymore. It is measured in hearings missed, in children's birthdays counted on fingers, in comrades' names that stop appearing in letters because they have gone into exile, or underground, or the ground. The doctor frowns. He orders x-rays. The results take weeks to come back. Paperwork travels slowly when it concerns prisoners, and slower still when those prisoners are enemies of the state. When the diagnosis finally arrives, it is blunt, clinical, indifferent to politics. Carcinoma of the jaw, a word that means the inner clock has just been wound faster. They do not tell him immediately. There are discussions first, in offices with closed doors, between prison authorities and security officials and men in dark suits, who never give their names to the guards. If Bram Fischer dies in prison, what will it mean? Another martyr, some argue, another name to be added to the lists, read out in secret meetings, whispered over photocopiers in London and Lusaka. "Better to keep him alive," says one voice, "for as long as possible. Let illness do slowly what bars and warders have not yet done. Reduce him to a diminished, dependent man, a living warning." But the cancer is not interested in their strategy. The pain intensifies. Swallowing becomes torture. Sleep turns into shallow snatches between waves of agony. His letters home grow shorter, more cramped, as if each line costs him more effort than the last. He still tries, even now, to shield his family. "I am well enough," he writes to Molly, the ink wobbling when the pain in his jaw spikes. "Do not worry. The worst part is the boredom, not the conditions." It is a small, desperate lie. He does not want her to picture what is actually happening. The thin blanket pulled up around his shoulders in the middle of the day, because the pain makes him shiver. The way he has to pause halfway through a sentence when speaking to a warder because his jaw will not quite obey him. One night, the pain rips through him so violently that he collapses on the cell floor. The warder comes, swears under his breath. There is paperwork when prisoners fall, and calls for help. In the infirmary, under lights that hum like insects, the doctor looks at the chart, at the man on the narrow bed, and understands that they have waited too long. He argues, this time not about politics or ideology, but about basic medicine. He needs proper treatment, the doctor says to the warden, radiation, possibly surgery. And soon, if you do nothing, you are not just jailers anymore. You are executioners. The word hangs in the air, heavy. Executioners. It is the one thing the state insists it is not. Not in this case. They did not hang him. They did not shoot him at dawn against a wall. They sentenced him, quite legally, to life. The rest, what happens inside his body, the slow decaying of a jawbone under assault from cells gone mad, is technically not their responsibility. But it will look that way when the story gets out. Eventually, under the double pressure of medical urgency and international scrutiny that never entirely goes away, they move him, first to a prison hospital with slightly better facilities. Then, when it becomes clear that even that is not enough, they consider the unthinkable. Compassionate release. Not full freedom, not really, more like an administrative decision to shift the dying man out of their direct custody and into a different kind of confinement, one that will look better on paper when he finally succumbs. There is talk, again, of conditions. If he signs a statement expressing regret, if he undertakes not to engage in political activity, if he agrees to keep silent, the old, quietly open door appears once more in front of him, much narrower now. Behind it, there is no real life, just a few more months of sunlight through a different window. But the same price is written on it in invisible ink. Renounce what made you dangerous. He refuses. The cancer does not. By early 1975, he is visibly a dying man. Even warders, who once took grim satisfaction in his suffering, now avert their eyes. There is something indecent about watching such a decline at close range, the way his face, once expressive and sharp, has become a skull, with eyes that still, stubbornly, try to focus on the pages of books he can barely hold. In the end, the state makes its choice. They release him to his brother's house in Bloemfontein, under strict conditions. It is a legal fiction. On paper, he is still a prisoner, still serving a life sentence. In reality, the prison walls have simply moved, becoming the boundaries of a family home, watched constantly by plainclothes police. He arrives in an ambulance, not a car. The bed they have prepared for him looks clean, soft, almost indecently luxurious after the institutional cots of prison. He sinks into it with a sigh that is half relief, half resignation. The room smells of polish and old books instead of bleach and sweat. Through the window, he can see a strip of sky more generous than the one he stared at through barred glass for so many years. He begins to measure time differently now, not in years of sentence, not in calendar pages peeled off the wall, but in visits. A doctor, a priest, a friend allowed in under watchful eyes. His children, older now, their faces lined with years of worry he was not there to share. They sit by his bed and talk about small things: the weather, a school achievement, a new law passed in Parliament that everyone knows is terrible, but that no one wants to give space in the sick room. Sometimes, when the painkillers blur the edges of the day, he drifts. He imagines for a few moments a different life, one in which he stayed on the safe side of history, one in which he is sitting in his own comfortable study right now, perhaps reading about, in the newspaper, some unfortunate lawyer who took the path he actually chose. A curiosity, a warning. In those moments, the twist in the story presents itself as a bitter joke. He could have been the man reading about Bram Fischer, rather than the man everyone is arguing about in whispers. But when the fog lifts, when his mind sharpens for an hour or two, his answer to that unasked question remains the same as it was in the dock. No, better this. Better the pain in his jaw, the weakness in his limbs, the knowledge that he has less time than the men who sentenced him, than the slow, suffocating dishonesty of a life lived against his own conscience. One afternoon, as the light slants through the curtains in thin golden blades, a visitor arrives whose presence goes unrecorded in any official register. Not Percy Utah himself. History is not that fond of neat theatrics, but a messenger of sorts, a young advocate, white, Afrikaner, carrying, within him, the careful, conflicted respect of a generation trained on one narrative, but increasingly drawn to another. He sits beside Bram's bed, nervously turning his hat in his hands and blurts out what he has rehearsed. "My seniors say you threw everything away," he says. "But when I read your speech, when I think about what the law is being used for, I don't know, it feels like—" He trails off, ashamed of saying too much in a house that might very well be full of hidden ears. Bram's voice is a rasp now, the jaw swollen, words sometimes smudged by pain, but his eyes are bright. "It feels," he finishes for the young man, "like you might have to choose, one day, between the law and justice." The advocate nods, once. "Then remember," Bram says, "the law can be changed. Consciences, once broken, cannot." A simple exchange. A small scene in a small room. But this is how legacies shift hands sometimes, not in official ceremonies, but in the quiet, private transfer of doubt and courage between one generation and the next. On 8th May 1975, the clock that has been winding down inside him finally stops. The official record notes the fact in a few spare lines. Date, time, cause. No mention of the years of resistance before the diagnosis. No mention of the rivalry that threaded through his career. The battles of words and wills with men like Utah. No mention of the decisions that turned an Afrikaner heir into a revolutionary. The funeral is heavily policed. Plainclothesmen lean against trees, pretending to study the sky, eyes constantly scanning the small crowd for familiar faces. Comrades are barred from attending. The state is afraid that even in death, he might gather people around him in a way they cannot control. They scatter his ashes in a place the family is not allowed to know. A final, mean-spirited attempt to deny him a resting place that can be visited, honored, turned into a site of memory. To the apartheid state, even dust can be dangerous if people start gathering around it with candles and songs. For a while, it seems like they might succeed in shrinking him. In the official histories taught in white schools, his name barely appears. When it does, it is in the tone of a footnote, an example of a talented man led astray, a moral lesson about the dangers of ideology. But history, like time, is not as obedient as those who write laws imagine. On Robben Island, word of his death reaches Mandela and the other prisoners. They stand in their own exercise yard, wind from the sea crusting the concrete with salt, and consider what it means that the man who once stood in court, arguing for their lives, has died, while they still wake each morning to the clang of cell doors. The news settles on them like an extra weight, but also like a reminder. If he can give his life for this cause from the comfortable side of the racial divide, how much more fiercely must they hold on? A year later, in 1976, students in Soweto pour into the streets. They face bullets with raised, empty hands. They shout slogans that would have earned them the same charges Bram once faced, furthering the aims of banned organizations, communism, sabotage. Somewhere behind the hard edges of their anger is the echo of a choice he made decades earlier. To step out of the ranks he was born into and stand instead beside those his own people are crushing. The regime that hoped to erase him with a life sentence and an unmarked scattering of ashes now finds itself facing a generation that has unknowingly inherited his refusal. Years pass. The faces at the top of the state change. The machinery remains the same, until finally, under the accumulated weight of internal uprising and international pressure, it begins to crack. When Nelson Mandela walks out of Victor Verster prison in 1990, the cameras flash, the world holds its breath, and another clock, this one measuring the life of apartheid itself, begins its final countdown. In the new South Africa that slowly, painfully takes shape, names are reassessed, statues fall, streets are renamed. Lawyers and judges, some of whom once whispered about Fischer as a taboo example, now speak his name in public lectures as a model of professional and moral courage. Scholarships are founded in his honor. Students write theses about him. Fellow Afrikaners who once spat out the word traitor, now, if they are honest, admit that his treason was to something rotten, and his loyalty was to a country that did not yet exist. And Percy Utah? He retires, lauded for his service by the state he served so meticulously. Later, in the new dispensation, he offers half apologies in interviews, insisting that he was only doing his job, that he was a servant of the law, not politics. But the story people tell about him is a narrow one. The prosecutor of Mandela, the face of Rivonia from the state's side. His name lives in a single, tightly framed scene. Bram's name stretches across more. Oxford debates, treason trials, clandestine meetings, the dock, the cell, the sickbed. The rivalry that once seemed so personal between them dissolves into something larger. In the end, it is not a race between two men, but between two ideas of what South Africa could be, one rooted in obedience to unjust laws, the other in disobedience to preserve a deeper justice, one backed by uniforms and guns and the ticking machinery of the state, the other carried by voices in courtrooms and songs in prison. Yards and young people on dusty streets, the state thought it could outlast Bram Fischer. It gave him a life sentence, and believed that, by enclosing his days in brick and barbed wire, it had won. It did not see that the real time limit was not on him, but on itself. His body failed before his sentence did. His jawbone crumbled sooner than the walls of Pretoria prison. He did not live to see Mandela take the oath of office as president, or to walk in a country where his own past crimes were recognized as acts of courage. But his choice, that quiet, steady decision to step out of the protection of his birth and into the peril of solidarity, crossed the prison walls more easily than any letter. It slipped past censors, survived interrogations, traveled in stories, and in the private, uneasy thoughts of young lawyers turning their hats in their hands. The man they tried to bury in an unmarked, scattered way became, in the end, a kind of measure. When the new South Africa needed to ask itself who, among its white citizens, had truly been an ally in the darkest years, it did not look to those who had kept their heads down and their consciences quiet. It looked to the man who, when offered more time in comfort in exchange for silence, chose less time in pain in exchange for the right to keep saying no. And so, somewhere beyond dates and court files and fading photographs, the last, unexpected twist in Bram Fischer's story reveals itself. They thought they had given him a lifetime. He turned what little time he really had into something much more dangerous, an example that refuses to run out.